The 2024 film Heretic, written by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, is a psychological thriller that quietly functions as a philosophical experiment. The film follows two young Mormon missionaries, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton, who are going door to door spreading their faith. And when they arrive at the home of Mr. Reed, a seemingly polite but intellectually unsettling man, they expect a simple religious conversation. But instead, they find themselves trapped in a psychological and philosophical labyrinth of sorts. Mr. Reed systematically challenges their beliefs and forces them to confront questions about their faith, truth, authority, and even the nature of reality itself. What makes Heretic particularly interesting to me as a philosophy student is that it draws from a wide range of philosophical texts. I did some digging, in fact, and found a Reddit question and answer session where the writers of this movie revealed that they had used several texts in the making of this film, several of which were by pretty well-known philosophers, including Plato, Jean Baudrillard, Guy Debord, and even Nick Bostrom. Each of these thinkers examine a different dimension of truth and belief that we can see appear or manifest in certain ways, either in the plot of the movie or in the general themes of the movie. So Plato, for example, explores how truth emerges through dialogue and questioning. Baudrillard examines how modern societies construct simulated realities. Debord critiques systems of ideology that shape perception and social control. And Bostrom asks whether reality itself could actually be a simulation. And together, these ideas and these thinkers form the intellectual backbone and the philosophical underpinnings of the movie Heretic. And so this film becomes more than just your regular traditional horror story, and it actually is sort of a philosophical confrontation with the question of how do we know that what we believe is true? Plato is one of the most influential philosophers in Western history, and unlike many Western philosophers, he didn't write traditional essays explaining his ideas directly. He didn't present his readers or his audience with written down doctrine of ideas or beliefs that they ought to have, and instead he wrote in dialogue form. He wrote dramatic conversations between characters, with Socrates, his teacher, usually featuring as one of the central characters in the dialogues. So Socrates believed that wisdom begins with recognizing your own ignorance. So rather than lecturing people, he would engage them in conversation and ask them a series of probing questions. And this process is now known as the Socratic method. So this method works through several steps. Firstly, someone claims to know something. For example, justice means obeying the law. Secondly, Socrates would ask a question that sort of draws this belief into a form of tension. They are tested on their definition. Contradictions in their definition begin to appear. And lastly, this person has to grapple with this tension and this contradiction within their own answer, and realize that their understanding is not complete. This result is a state that is called aporia in Greek philosophy. Aporia means confusion or puzzlement, and Socrates believed that this confusion was actually productive as it opened a path toward genuine knowledge. In Plato's Phaedrus, he explores themes like rhetoric and persuasion, the nature of the soul, and the difference between truth and manipulation. One of Plato's concerns is the misuse of rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion. So rhetoric can be used to guide people toward truth, but it can also be used to manipulate them. And Socrates argues that a true teacher, a true pedagogical practitioner, would understand the nature of the human soul in order to guide it towards the truth. Plato's Republic, which is another book or text that the writers claim to have drawn inspiration from, examines things like justice, knowledge, and the structure of an ideal society. One of the most famous passages in this work is the allegory of the cave. Now, in this allegory, prisoners are chained inside a cave and they can only see shadows projected on a wall, and they believe these shadows to be reality. But if one prisoner escapes and sees the outside world, he realizes that these shadows weren't reality and were in fact just illusions. Plato uses this story to illustrate a really profound philosophical point that most people mistake appearances for reality. So then philosophy, according to Plato, is the process of escaping this cave and discovering the deeper truths behind appearances. In the movie, Mr. Reed takes on this pedagogical role, using the Socratic method on the girls and leading them to question their own faith through a series of provocative questions. He doesn't simply tell them what he believes the truth to be, but rather designs a whole game resembling a quest for truth. Their dialectical struggle is a real, physical, deadly struggle, and much like with philosophizing, they do not come out of the struggle unscathed. However, Mr. Reed differs from Socrates in a very crucial way. He is essentially performing a distorted version of the Socratic method. Socrates asked questions to lead people towards truth, but Mr. Reed asks questions to destabilize and dominate. So Mr. Reed is essentially transforming philosophical inquiry into a sort of psychological manipulation. And the missionaries experience something similar to Plato's aporia, and their certainty collapses and they're forced to confront the fragility of their beliefs. The next philosophical text used by the writers was Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. This text explores the relationship between reality, symbols, and society. So, simulacra can be thought of as a copy without an original. So it's a copy of something that either has no original or has replaced its original. So over time, these copies accumulate until they form what Baudrillard refers to as hyperreality. So hyperreality is a state in which the distinction between reality and simulation disappears. Baudrillard talks about the 4 stages through which images evolve. So the first stage is a reflection of reality, where the image accurately represents something real. The second stage is a distortion of reality, where the image alters or manipulates reality in some way. Thirdly, there is the masking of the absence of reality, where the image pretends to represent something real that no longer exists. And then lastly, we have pure simulation, where the image has no relationship to reality whatsoever. And at this final stage, society becomes immersed into hyperreality. Mr. Reed illustrates this kind of concept using what I have come to call his iterations speech. So he gives the example of Monopoly, which billions of people have played, but only a fraction have finished. And he mentions how Monopoly is based on the original Landlord's game, which is nearly identical to Monopoly in every fundamental way, and Monopoly is simply an iteration of the Landlord's game. So in this example, the Landlord's game, which is the original, can be thought of as Judaism, where Christianity is analogous with Monopoly, which is a copy of Judaism. Mormonism is a spin-off of Christianity, which is a spin-off of Judaism. So Mormonism is a spin-off of a spin-off, a copy of a copy. These are all iterations of the same source material. Mr. Reed's point is that iterations over time dilute the message and obscure the original. In a way, Christianity can be thought of as a hyperreal religion. It is detached from its origin, it has multiple copies and interpretations, and it has become commodified and commercialized. As Mr. Reed puts it in the movie, there are salespeople selling you the religion. These two missionaries have literally gone knocking on people's doors trying to convince people to convert to Mormonism. Mr. Reed takes this argument even further. Christianity is a copy of an even longer history of religions and religious iterations than he previously implied. Every religion shares commonalities, and all the myths and stories that you find in the Abrahamic religions all appear in the earliest religions in some format. In a way, religion is as hollow and as capitalistic as the board games that he uses to illustrate his point. Mr. Reed is also suggesting that religions may function as symbolic systems that structure reality for its believers. From this perspective, things like religious symbols, rituals, narratives can all become simulacra, representations that replace a direct spiritual experience. So these missionaries inhabit a worldview where religious teachings define what is real and meaningful. And Mr. Reed attempts to dismantle this worldview by showing them how beliefs can be constructed systems of signs rather than absolute truths. And this is deeply unsettling in a way because it suggests that the reality we inhabit may be built from symbolic structures rather than objective truths. The next philosophical text the writers drew from is The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. Debord was a French philosopher and a revolutionary thinker, and his book, Society of the Spectacle, argues that modern capitalist societies are dominated by the spectacle. He argues that under capitalism, real life is displaced into another zone. This zone is abstract and it takes place in media rather than through direct interpersonal communication. The spectacle isn't just entertainment or media. Debord actually defines it as a social relationship between people mediated by images. In other words, instead of interacting directly with the world, people increasingly interact through representations. Debord builds on the ideas of Karl Marx, and Marx argued that capitalism alienates workers from their labor. Now, Debord expands this idea, arguing that modern society alienates people from their entire lived experience. Life becomes something that is observed and consumed and performed rather than actively lived. So in a way, people are becoming spectators in their own lives. The spectacle also functions as a system of ideological control. By shaping how people perceive reality, it reinforces existing power structures. Images, narratives, and institutions create the appearance of a stable social order, but this order depends on people accepting certain symbolic frameworks without questioning them. In this Debordian view, religion in this movie can be understood as an ideological structure that organizes perception and behavior. So the missionaries have internalized a system of beliefs that tells them what's morally true, what the world means, and even what their purpose is. And these beliefs function like a framework through which they interpret reality. So what Mr. Reed is doing is challenging this framework and forcing them to confront the possibility that their worldview is not simply the truth, but a socially constructed system of meaning. The last philosophical thinker that the writers mention they drew from is Nick Bostrom. So Nick Bostrom's famous simulation argument suggests that at least one of the following statements must be true. 1. Almost no civilizations reach advanced technological stages. 2. Advanced civilizations choose not to simulate their ancestors. 3. We are likely living in a simulation. This argument is presented in his famous paper, are you living in a computer simulation? And is based on probability. If advanced civilizations create large numbers of simulated worlds, then the number of simulated minds could vastly exceed the number of real minds. And in that case, statistically speaking, it would be more than likely that we are simulated observers rather than original ones. Now, this simulation hypothesis raises very deep philosophical concerns. Epistemologically speaking, if we're living in a simulation, our observations of the universe would not necessarily reveal the true nature of reality. The laws of physics, for example, might simply be the rules of the simulation. Reality could exist in layers, metaphysically speaking. There could be simulated worlds, a base reality, and even simulations with simulations. Although the movie Heretic doesn't necessarily literally depict a computer simulation, the structure of the film does mirror the logic of the simulation hypothesis. So inside Mr. Reed's house, the environment is controlled, information is manipulated, and the characters must operate within a system designed by somebody else. So Mr. Reed, in this way, effectively becomes the architect of the scenario, similar to how a simulation creator would design a digital environment. And the two girls are forced to confront the unsettling possibility that their entire understanding of reality may depend on systems that they do not control. At first glance, the movie Heretic might appear to be a simple psychological horror, but when we examine the film through the philosophical texts that inspired it, the movie reveals itself to be a meditation on belief, reality, and knowledge. Each philosopher contributes a different dimension to the film's themes. Plato shows how questioning can expose the fragility of belief. Baudrillard reveals how symbolic systems can replace reality. Debord explains how social structures can shape perception, and Bostrom raises the possibility that reality itself could be constructed. Together, these ideas lead to the film's most disturbing implication, that the frameworks we rely on to understand the world may themselves be unstable. In this way, the horror of the movie is not simply the danger that is posed by Mr. Reed himself, but the realization that certainty can collapse when the systems that support our beliefs are challenged. And once these systems break down, we're left facing the same question that philosophers have asked for centuries. How do we truly know what is real?